So, have you ever just had enough? Like, man, I've had enough. I can't stand it anymore. And it turns out there is some more. You know, you got this thing you're trying to get through, you're trying to work through, you're trying to figure out how to solve this problem, and it's hard, and you're kind of tired of it, and you see the finish line. If I can just kind of push forward until I get to this place, I'll be done. And then you get there, and you're not done. Like, if you've ever hiked in the mountains, and you're hiking in the mountains, you're pushing on, you're getting tired, you kind of see the summit up there, and you feel like you can't really go much further, but I'm not going to turn back now. I'm almost to the top. And we keep going, and as you approach the top, and as your eyes come over to the summit, you realize that wasn't the top. In hiking, we call it a false summit, that because of the angle of the mountain, you thought you were looking at the top, but it was actually blocking your view. So when you get to what you think is the top, you realize you just hit a small plateau before you start going up again. And it's times like that that make us want to stop. To say that, you know, if I was done, I'd be okay, but I'm not done, and I don't feel like I can keep going. And as we've gone through this series we've been in these past few weeks, Against the Odds, that's where we left it last week, right? That we've been walking through the book of Esther, right? And in Esther, you know, we've seen her do these incredible things, right? Starting out as an orphan, rising up to become queen of Persia, the most powerful, or one of the most powerful empires of its time. And then through that, her cousin Mordecai, who had raised her, gets into this position in the palace as an official. And that all happens. But last week, she thought she had gotten there. She thought she had achieved her goal. And then she found out she hadn't. And so what's she going to do? Does she give up? Or does she choose to see it through? Because that's the choice we have to make sometimes. Right? That as tired as we are, as hard as it is, as much as we want to stop, if we stop, then we don't achieve the outcome. And sometimes we have to keep moving long after we're tired. And that's what happens for Esther. Remember that the whole problem is that although Esther was queen, right, she didn't really have full authority, but she had access, she had privilege. She was queen. Her cousin Mordecai, who she trusts a great deal, is an official in the empire. That seems like it should be good. He's actually in the palace area. It seemed like life should have been okay, but then this guy Haman came along. And Haman decided that he didn't like Mordecai. In fact, he didn't just dislike Mordecai, he liked everybody who was related to Mordecai. And so he decides that he is going to have them all wiped out. So using some really deceptive practices, he convinces the king that there's this group of people who needs to be entirely wiped from the face of the earth. And the people he's talking about is Mordecai's people, right? The people of Israel, because they're spread throughout the empire. So what Mordecai had told Esther last week, this is kind of what we focused on last week, was that Mordecai said to Esther, you're the only one that can do something about this. You have to do something about this. You have to go talk to the king. So Esther agreed to go talk to the king in spite of the fact that she was incredibly afraid to, because she was going to break protocol, which isn't just a minor thing. Punishment for breaking that protocol was death. That she was going to go see the king without first being invited. And that was considered a threat to the crown. So she prepared herself, she prayed, she got ready, she went in, and she got to the king. And the king agreed to see her. And then she puts together this, I think, this kind of incredibly brilliant plan where she actually gets the king and Haman together. And she kind of gets Haman off his guard a little bit, endears herself to the king a little bit. And then finally, at just the right moment, she reveals to the king that this guy Haman is plotting to kill my people and wipe them off the face of the earth. And that, of course, gets the king's attention, because she did a great job of saying, this doesn't just affect my people, this affects me. And then the king saw that as a threat to him as well. And so the king has Haman arrested. Haman is dealt with. And then just as we finished last week, Esther said to the king, okay, that decree that was issued in your name that's supposed to have my people killed, please repeal that decree. And what did he say? Once it's been issued in my name, with my signet ring, in other words, my symbol, my seal on it, it can never be repealed. It is a permanent order. And that had to completely suck the wind out of Esther's sail. She had worked so hard. She'd gotten to this moment. She thought that if she could just defeat Haman, this would all be done. Now, she has defeated Haman, and that was a necessary step, but the work isn't done. I mean, how much do you think that she wants to give up right now? How about you in times like that? How about me in times like that? You want to have a health thing that just keeps going, and you think you got it this time, and it doesn't. You got a personal thing that you've been fighting through, or maybe a family member that you thought maybe we could get along this time, and we don't. How much do we want to keep going? And we have to decide whether it's worth it. We have to decide whether staying with it and getting to the outcome is worth it. Are we willing to see it through, even though doing so is incredibly hard? And ultimately, Esther decides that I am going to stay in this, that this is really hard, but I'm going to try to keep going. I'm going to do what I can to save my people. But one of the things that happens for Esther is that as she makes that transition, as she makes the transition to say, okay, I've gotten to the point of dealing with Haman and there's further to go, she does something that I think that we can sometimes lose sight of in our own life. Right? Up to this point in Esther's life, this battle has been entirely hers. Right? She was the only one with the access to reach the king. No one else would have even gotten close. And she was the only one who was in a position to bring the king and Haman together and to do all those things that allowed her to defeat Haman. So up until now, the battle has been entirely hers. But now she can do something that she couldn't do before. She can bring in help. And this is the thing that I think that we all want to kind of keep on our minds, is that oftentimes the most difficult battles in our life are indeed ours, right? We have to do those. There's things we have to go through. But because a battle is ours, sometimes we think we have to do the whole thing alone. That I can't bring anyone else in to help me. There's no one else that can step in and just maybe even just be support. Someone to talk through. Someone to give us a different perspective. Someone to bring in skills or viewpoints that aren't the same as ours. Well, that's what Esther does. Esther does, I think, what most needed to be done. She realizes she needs some help, and she seizes the moment. Narrative tells us that on the same day, in other words, just after the events, king capturing Haman, on that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And so this is kind of the king making restitution. Haman has harmed you and your family, therefore I'm going to grant you all of his resources. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. And think of the weight that fell off of Esther's shoulders in this one day. Remember that when Esther entered into this process that ultimately led to her becoming queen, she was told, never reveal who you are. If you reveal who you are, they're not going to accept you. But now in this one day, she has revealed that she is part of the nation of Israel, and the king still loves her. And that also Mordecai is her cousin. And this starts to bring something really important together. Because remember that Mordecai was already a trusted official. He was actually allowed very close to the area where the king is. He also had helped save the king's life. So the king's probably got a fairly positive view of Mordecai before any of this starts. And now Esther tells him that this is the man who, when my parents died, cared for me and raised me and helped me to grow into the person that you know today. And that impresses the king. And so the king says, you're someone I can trust. So he bestows more authority on the Mordecai. It says the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. This is an incredible turn of events. Basically now, Esther, and therefore Mordecai, has everything that belonged to Haman. They've gotten all of his property. Remember, he had substantial property. He had substantial resources. Remember that he had promised to do this huge payoff to the crown in order to pull off this execution. So Mordecai now has access to those resources to do what needs to be done. But also that signet ring, right, that represents the authority of the king. That's the thing that's used to seal decrees to say this is really from the king. Remember, Haman had it before, Mordecai has it now. Remember, when Haman had that ring, what did that mean for him? He was the second most powerful person in the entire empire. The only person who was more powerful was the king. Well, if Mordecai has that ring, what's it mean for him now? He now is the second most powerful person in the empire. The only person who's more powerful is the king. All the things that were being used to destroy Esther, Mordecai, and their people are now in their possession. They now can use those same tools to care for the people that they care about. They can now use those same tools to save their people. And so now, since Mordecai is able to act on behalf of the king, he speaks to the king and gets permission to write a new decree. And the king says, write what you feel needs to be written. And that decree does the thing that is most needed. Remember that no decree that can be written that repeals the original one, that has to stay in place. So what Mordecai does, the king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite, to defend their lives. Now, you might go, well, do you really need a decree for that? Like, why not just defend yourselves? It was illegal. The way things worked when an empire comes through and has conquered a nation, and that nation is under their control, one of the most important things for the conquering nation is to make sure the conquered don't rise up. So you weren't allowed to pull together with the other people of your nation, because that was considered an affront to the crown. It was considered to be trying to do an overthrow. So this decree allowed them to pull together, to work together. And because they were allowed to defend themselves, they could come together as an army, something that would have been specifically prohibited. And this had huge implications, because now things have changed a great deal. Prior to this decree, every family would have been on their own. Effectively, every person would have been on their own. But now they can stand together. They're permitted to organize. And then rather than just fighting for themselves, they could fight for each other. And that's a really big step. But the battle's not over yet. But in spite of that, in spite of the fact that the battle's not over yet, when the decree arrives to the various cities, something that seems quite strange happens. It says that in every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and a holiday. What are they celebrating? Right, the battle still lies ahead. What are they celebrating? Well, I think that what we see here are kind of two really important things going on. Right, the first thing is that they're happy. Right, they're given this opportunity to work together. In fact, the reality is that they need to work together. And there are two ways of looking at that. When you have to work together, you can either bemoan the fact that you're giving up your independence and, I shouldn't have to worry about someone else, I'm just all about me. Or you can say that, you know what? We're better together. We're better giving up maybe a little bit of individualism to get along. We're better off when we don't just pursue what we want, but when we come together and pursue what's best for the whole thing. And that's what they did. They embraced this kind of cause-centered community that will put our differences aside. We will align on what's most important. And we'll do it because we're better together than we are apart. But then the other thing that seems so strange is kind of back to that celebration idea, right? That they were celebrating. Again, the battle still lies ahead, right? They have not won anything. In fact, they might even lose when the battle comes, right? They haven't even fought the battle. So what is there to celebrate? A breakthrough. They have hope where they did not have hope before. kind of use kind of modern language, they've had an intermediate success. They've achieved a milestone, right? That they actually had no hope at all prior to this decree arriving. And now suddenly they have hope. Doesn't mean they've won, but something good and something important has happened. And this is something that's so important in our own lives, is that, I'm a person who is always focused on the end goal. I always want to keep moving. But that's not really the best way to go about things. We do a lot better if we will celebrate small victories along the way. Right? There's this huge temptation to wait until the very end, to wait until that very final victory, and when we've won the whole thing, because anything less than that doesn't matter, is what we tell ourselves. But the reality is that everything that leads up to that matters. Because big victories are rarely won by a single activity. Big victories are won by small, sometimes seemingly insignificant things that occur one after another and move us forward. And here's the thing, that those most difficult battles in our lives, those kind of longest running ones, those ones that run on so long we're just exhausted with it, we're just sick of it. As those battles carry on, we become discouraged. Kind of back to that, I thought I was at the top of the mountain, and it turns out there's still so much more. So I can either complain that that's still more to go, or I can say, hey, I've made it this far. Let me rest for a second, and then I'll carry on. I think what we need to realize is that the challenges we face in our lives don't wait to the very end, right? Life is long. Challenges pop up all the time. So if challenges can pop up along the journey, why not celebrate along the journey as well? Because the thing is that when we do big things, when we do important things, when we do really hard things, the road feels long because it is long. And if we have to slog one step after another, chances of success diminish. And if the whole thing is a slog, even when we get to the end, it doesn't feel like a victory because we're so beat up. But if along the way, as the good things happen, even when they're small things, even when they're so small, there's a temptation to go, that doesn't really matter. It does matter. And it's celebrating those things that make the difference. Why when we do kind of big projects in a business, we divide them into milestones, right? So we're not just shooting for something big at the end. We can see progress go along the way. And, maybe we don't throw a party, but we certainly celebrate when we achieve a particular milestone. What about when we're ill and we've been dealing with a health thing for a really long time, and doctor puts you on a new medication and suddenly it worked a little bit. Maybe it didn't work as well as you wanted, but you know what? You feel a little bit better than you did, right? Celebrate those sort of things. If you've ever known someone who has struggled with a problem with debt and they've gotten themselves kind of way underwater, right? If they've got 10 credit cards that they've maxed out, what do you do when they pay off the first credit card? You celebrate. Yes, there are 9 more to go, but you know what? You moved one step closer to hitting your goal. That's how we do in everything, or that's how we should do in everything. And again, I am the biggest one who fails to do this. But if we will actually celebrate those victories along the way, that's how we can see it through. Because we get a little bit of energy, right? Just like coming over the slope of that first hill, taking a break. And when you take a break, why don't you enjoy the view for just a moment? And then suddenly it's a little bit more worth it. You got a little bit more a little more gas left in the tank than you thought you did. And you can go a little bit further. Life is hard. Celebrate your victories. Not just the big ones, the small ones too. And that's what the people of Esther and Mordecai did. And what it did is actually brought them together, because they are in a shared battle, but there's also the beauty of a shared celebration. So with that, they are now pulled together. Right? The Jewish people throughout the empire have now pulled together in each of the cities to work together to be ready for when this battle comes. And in doing that, they've now done the things that they can do. And we talked about this last week, the importance of doing what you can. And they've done what they can. And as they do that, something amazing started to happen. Other people throughout the empire began to support them. People from other nations started to join in with them. And not just common people, nobles stepped up and joined in with them. Military officers stepped up and joined in with them. And now they are far stronger, not only far stronger than they were before they organized, but they are now stronger than they could have possibly imagined. Because now they've got military know-how and even more people. Now, why is this happening? Now, there's probably a couple reasons. There's probably a couple reasons that people are joining in. I mean, there are some very human reasons probably why it's happening. Right? Mordecai is the number 2 guy. He's got the king's support. Mordecai said the Jews are going to be allowed to defend themselves. A lot of people are probably like, I want to be on the right side of Mordecai. So I'm going to go ahead along with what he says. There's probably some of that. But I think the bigger factors were beyond that. I think, first of all, as the people around saw the Jewish people gathering to defend themselves, knowing they're facing a battle, but celebrating their ability and their willingness to come together, people are attracted to that. It's like, I want to be part of what they're doing. So that started to draw people in. But I think there was something bigger still. I think what they saw was God beginning to move in this. That God was starting to pull the people together. And I think that's something we can see in our own lives. And this is, again, something we talked a little bit about last week, is that we talked about this: do what you can, and God will do what you can't. And when we're in these kind of really long battles, we have these difficult things we're trying to deal with, so often it feels like nothing is happening. I mean, how often have you been in a difficult situation, you're kind of like, God, where are you? Why aren't you here right now? But then things can start to change, particularly once we get to work. Right? That's what we see in the story of Esther. It was once the people got to work doing what they could that the movement of God started to show up. Because I think there's this temptation that we can think that if we're a believer in God, if we're a Jesus follower, we can believe that it's some kind of passive life, that we're supposed to just kind of, pray to God and hope for the best. Now, praying is what you want to do, but we don't sit back, right? We don't just kind of submit our order to God and see what he does. What we do is we pray, but then we get to work, right? That's the key thing. That's what we see happening in Esther, is that they were praying throughout, but they got the work, right? They actually got out there and did the things that they can do. That if we want to achieve really big things in our lives, we've got to put those two things together. There's a phrase I love that actually captures this. This actually comes from a guy named Basil King. Basil King was a minister a little over 100 years ago. And he had an interesting thing, that he was a minister over the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and he lost his eyesight. And he became a writer, an incredibly successful writer. And in a book he wrote roughly 100 years ago, he said, "Be bold, and mighty forces will come to your aid." His point is that when we live in relationship with God, it is not a passive event. It's not a place where we tell God what we think he needs to do and wait for him to do it. Life in relationship with God is active and it is connected. And so if you want to see God do big things in your life, if I want to see God do big things in my life, what we need to do is step out, do hard things, step out into scary places, choose destinations that you cannot quite get to on your own. Now, I'm not saying be reckless, but push ourselves, reach for big things, and then do all we can in our power to achieve them, praying along the way. Right? When I was overweight to the point that it was killing me, I could have sat there and prayed. You know what else I could do? I could stop eating bacon. Right? I could take action that actually fixed me up a little bit. I could exercise, and I lost 120 pounds. Right? Didn't do that in a week. I didn't do it in a month. I didn't do it in a year. But over years, I did that. And please understand, I'm not trying to elevate myself at all. It was through the power of God that I stayed in it and stayed with it. But this applies to every area of our lives. If we're looking for a better job, right, pray, but then pound the pavement. Upgrade your skills, sort of thing. Right? In any area of life where we're looking for a different outcome, it starts with prayer. We stay with prayer, but we also do all that we can do. And sometimes that's hard, right? Because sometimes what we have to do is face hard realities along the way, right? That we have to recognize that we might have to adjust our attitude about things. We might have to embrace new skills, develop new skills. We might have to let go of things we've been carrying with us for a long time. We might have to stop doing things the way we've always done them. Because I think, in general, prayer without action does not generally produce much in terms of results. But the combination of prayer and action yields amazing results. It is life transforming. It transforms our own experiences and allows us to transform the lives of other people if we're willing to do it. Now, for Esther and Mordecai, I believe that's what they saw happening. They had done what they could. They had been tight in prayer, and they're seeing this amazing thing happen, that their people are able to organize. They're getting support and skills stepping into the mix that they could not have pulled together themselves. But now, finally, the long-awaited day occurs. Now, remember, there's something kind of strange going on here. Because remember that when Haman got permission to write this decree to wipe out the Jewish people, he had to do it all in one day. And so they'd done this kind of strange thing that they have cast lots, kind of a random situation. They're actually something called Purim is what they're actually called. So they cast these lots and that picked a date. It picked a date. And it ended up picking a date almost a year into the future. So for a year, the Jewish people had known that their execution was coming eventually. So that was the original decree that Haman wrote. Now, of course, Mordecai has written this other decree that allows them to pull together and organize themselves. It's the same date. They can defend themselves against those who attack them. That's what they're permitted to do. So those two decrees go into effect on the same day. What has the king just allowed? He's effectively allowed a massive civil war for just one day in his kingdom. And that day comes. So what happens? So on the planned day, the two decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemy of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. So Esther, Mordecai, and their people prevail. They defeat those who are attacking them. Now, at first glance, that feels a bit anticlimactic. It's like, I've got 4 weeks into the story. It just ends? What? But what's really going on here? Right? There's this one moment where the victory is played out, but was the victory won in a single day? They had been walking and working for almost a year to reach this moment. And that's something we have to keep in mind in our own lives, where we work really hard towards something. And then when it happens, often the moment of final success is really brief. And it can feel fleeting. And it can feel depressing sometimes. It's actually very common among top-tier athletes. It's in the battle, they're pumped up, but once it's over, they feel empty. And the thing we want to keep in mind is this one-day victory only happened because everything had happened in the year leading up to it. Right? Because think about how many times they faced major challenges. And I am certain that as I kind of go through this list of challenges, along the way, people wanted to give up because it seemed like success was impossible. I mean, think about the day that initial decree came out. That, hey, about roughly a year from now, you're all going to be executed. You get that in your mailbox, you notice, right? And you know that that's happening. And you have no ability to overpower this empire. This empire takes entire countries down. What are you going to be able to do? And they knew that for a year. Success seemed impossible. And then Mordecai tells Esther, somebody's got to do something, and that somebody's got to be you. And yes, I know you may be executed for trying to do something, but you have to do it. As Esther received that news, success seemed impossible. But then she steps out and she does what she's asked to do. And she puts together a really good plan and pulls it off and defeats Haman. And she thinks that's all she had to do, defeat Haman and we'll be good. And it turns out that wasn't quite enough. The decree to have her people killed could not be repealed. At that moment, success had to feel impossible. Day after day, for months, success likely felt impossible. But they didn't give up. They stayed in it. They stayed connected to God, and they did what they could do, and they found success. Success was not one day in the making. Success was 1 year in the making. Praying, staying connected to God, and doing all that they could. But then also, once the victory was won, and Mordecai has all this authority, he suggested something. He suggested one more thing. He suggested that they celebrate and they remember. And that's the holiday of Purim. That here, thousands of years later, Jewish people throughout the world celebrate the holiday of Purim. I don't know how many of you guys know this. I actually started this the week of Purim. I don't know if you guys knew that or not. But I launched on the 5th. Purim was the 7th. So they've celebrated this for years. And the way they celebrate it is actually quite amazing. Because we know that much of the events that Esther undertook, they were drinking wine. Do you know if you're an Orthodox Jew, you're depending on what sect of Judaism you are, you're required to drink wine on Purim? There are actually really cute pictures of like teenage boys kind of tanked for their first glass of wine sort of thing. And I don't mean that disparagingly at all. I mean that they are stepping into the joy of the moment and embracing it. Because what they do on Purim is they actually throw a party. It's a focus on joy. And then they tell the story of Esther. And then what they do throughout that holiday is they celebrate and they remember the bravery of Esther. They celebrate and they remember the work of Mordecai. They celebrate and they remember how the people came together, putting any differences and issues aside to work towards a common goal. And they celebrate and remember the work of God bringing all the pieces together that gave them the victory. For them, that victory was not a fleeting moment. It's something that is celebrated every year now for thousands of years. Celebrating and remembering is so important. In those long, difficult struggles we have in our lives, those times where we are pushing on and pushing on. And I'm quite certain that most of us, if not all of us, have had something in our lives that we thought we would never conquer, we would never beat, and we would never get to the other side of. But here you are. You did it. Celebrate and remember. Celebrate that it happened. Celebrate that you got to this point. It's so important for not just that one event. It's so important for our futures. Because you've been through hard things. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but you're probably going to be through more hard things. And it's going to feel like there's no way to succeed. And you're going to feel like you're alone sometimes. Just like you did last time. But you made it. And when we celebrate that we make it, and we remember that we made it, and we remember that God showed up even when it felt like he was being silent, the next time we're in it, we remember. And the next time we're in it, we can tell ourselves with confidence, I got through it last time, I'll get through it this time. God showed up last time, God's going to show up this time. And that's how we find the energy and the strength to go forward. Sometimes that's getting through our own lives. Sometimes that's making a difference in other people's lives when we step way out to do hard things. If we'll celebrate and remember what we've been through, what we've survived, and what God has done for us, it propels us to do things beyond what we believe we can.